My name is Claire Dawson. I'm 31 years old, a project manager living in Miami, and the only daughter in a family that never seemed to want me fully among them. I've been excluded before, from birthdays, from family vacations, even from my brother's wedding, but nothing cut deeper than the moment I discovered the $12,800 college fund I had been promised was gone. My mother had taken it, spent it, and left me to piece together my own future. If you're watching this, please subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Knowing where this story reaches matters, because for so long I felt invisible in my own family. December in Miami doesn't carry snow, but the air still thickens with anticipation as the year winds down. Lights hang from palm trees, shops pipe music into the streets, and the city hums with the energy of celebration. Yet for me, the season has always been colder than winter itself. I could see the city glowing with togetherness, but I carried only silence. The message came early in the month. My mother announced they were keeping New Year's Eve intimate this year. I knew exactly what that meant. It meant without me. It meant I would once again be on the outside, looking in on a celebration I had no place in. The sting was sharper because I knew others would be there. New partners, barely part of the family, distant relatives whose connection was thinner than mine. The word intimate was never about closeness. It was about exclusion. I stared at the message longer than I should have, my phone glowing in the dim light of my apartment. It wasn't the first time this had happened. I thought of Christmas mornings, where my gifts felt more like obligations than gestures, socks and notebooks, while my brother unwrapped electronics and games. I thought of birthdays forgotten, graduations missed, photographs where I was quietly guided out of the frame so the three of them could have their moment. Each memory settled on my chest like another stone. But this year, something inside me refused to bend. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel surprised. What I felt was a hollow clarity. For as long as I could remember, I had been waiting for them to choose me, waiting for the call, the message, the acknowledgement that never came. And in that moment, I realized the waiting was over. I remembered the college fund, that silent betrayal. The years of scraping through jobs, of piecing together tuition with loans and endless hours of work, all while knowing my mother had used the money meant for my future on herself. That wound had never healed. And now, as another holiday loomed, I understood what it had taught me. I could not depend on them for belonging. If I wanted a place, I would have to create it myself. From my balcony, I watched the city lights stretch across the water, reflections shimmering on the waves. Fireworks would soon light up the horizon, but I knew I wouldn't be there to celebrate with them. Not this time. Not after another December of silence. Something shifted in me that night. It wasn't just defiance. It was a quiet vow. If their table would never have a seat for me, then I would build my own. And it would be a table so undeniable that even in their absence, they would feel it. This would not be another year of being erased. This time, I would make the story unforgettable. I was 18 the day the truth came out, though in some ways I think I had been preparing for it my entire life. My mother had always promised me that when the time came, there would be money waiting for me to step into my future. She used to call it, "your college cushion," a small but meaningful fund set aside so I could focus on studying instead of scrambling for work. For years, I carried that promise like a fragile gift, something to hold on to when the rest of her attention drifted elsewhere. When it was finally time to enroll, I remember sitting at the kitchen table with forms spread in front of me, my acceptance letter tucked neatly on top. I asked about the fund, where it was, how we would access it, if it could be transferred directly to the university. My mother's response was so casual it didn't register at first. She said the money wasn't there anymore. She said she had needed it for something else, something she described as unavoidable. The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to clear. I remember asking her to explain, waiting for her to laugh and tell me it was a mistake. Instead, she listed off what she had used it for: home improvements, medical bills that weren't as urgent as she made them sound. Even a vacation she insisted had been necessary for her mental health. I sat frozen as she spoke, the number ringing in my ears. $12,800, gone, like it had never been mine at all. In that moment, the promise of my future crumbled. It wasn't just about tuition, though that weight would fall hard on me soon enough. It was about the betrayal embedded in her tone, the ease with which she dismissed the years of assurance she had given me. I realized she hadn't seen it as my fund, not really. She had seen it as hers, something convenient to dip into when she wanted. My dreams had been nothing more than a placeholder for her indulgence. The anger didn't come right away. At first, there was only numbness, like I had stepped outside of myself. I thought about the jobs I would need to take, the loans I would have to sign, the endless hours that would stretch ahead just to cover what should have been secured. I thought about how my brother had never needed to ask, how opportunities seemed to fall at his feet while I clutched at scraps. And I thought about the kind of love that could look a daughter in the eye and so easily erase her. Later, when I was alone in my room, the numbness gave way to something sharper. It was a mixture of humiliation and fury, the kind of realization that carves itself into your memory. I understood then that I could not rely on promises in my family. They were fragile, conditional, easily withdrawn. If I wanted stability, I would have to build it with my own hands, brick by brick, even if those hands shook with exhaustion. The months that followed were brutal. I worked shifts in retail, late nights tutoring, weekends answering phones at a call center. My friends talked about dorm parties and spring break trips while I counted every dollar to make sure tuition was paid on time. I told myself I was fine, that independence was worth it, but the truth is, I carried the weight of that betrayal everywhere I went. Every time I filled out a loan form or accepted another shift, I thought about the $12,800 that had once been meant for me. I thought about the way my mother had said it wasn't personal, that I would understand one day. But I didn't understand. Not then. Not now. What I understood instead was that my place in her world had always been conditional. I was loved when it was convenient, supported when it cost her nothing. The moment it required sacrifice, I was left to fend for myself. Looking back, I can see that the theft of that fund did more than empty my bank account before it ever existed. It rewrote the way I saw myself in relation to my family. It taught me that waiting for their approval was like waiting for rain in a drought, endless, suffocating, and pointless. Years later, I would still think about that number, about the exact figure that had once stood between me and a smoother path. It became a symbol, not just of what was taken, but of what I had been forced to become. Stronger, yes. Independent, undeniably. But also hardened, carrying a scar that no amount of success could erase. By the time another holiday season arrived, the wound had dulled but never healed. My family still spoke about gatherings as if nothing had happened, still brushed aside the weight of their choices. They pretended the betrayal had faded with time. But I knew better. Every December, when the invitations failed to arrive, I felt that same ache stir beneath the surface. And this year, as I stood staring at their message about keeping things intimate, the memory of that stolen future returned with a vengeance. The $12,800 was gone, but the lesson it left behind remained. I could never count on them to give me a place. If I wanted one, I would have to take it. When the dust settled after the discovery of the stolen fund, I thought the hardest part would be the financial scramble. What I didn't realize at the time was that the money wasn't the only thing I had lost. The theft had hollowed out something deeper, the belief that my family would ever stand behind me. Once that illusion shattered, I had to face the truth. Every step forward from here would be mine alone. I enrolled in college with a mixture of pride and fear. Pride, because I was going anyway, no matter how impossible it seemed. Fear, because I had no safety net. My tuition was a puzzle of loans, scholarships, and whatever hours I could stitch together from part-time jobs. While classmates filled their weekends with parties and road trips, I filled mine with shifts under fluorescent lights, folding clothes in retail stores, tutoring students who were sometimes only a year younger than me, answering phones in a cubicle that smelled like burnt coffee and recycled air. The exhaustion was constant. I remember nights when my hands trembled from too much caffeine and not enough food, Mornings when I dragged myself out of bed after only a few hours of sleep, knowing another double shift awaited me. My body felt like a machine running on fumes, but my mind never stopped spinning. Every dollar I earned became a small shield, a reminder that I could keep going even when no one expected me to. Friends would sometimes ask why I didn't lean on my parents more. I learned to brush it off with vague answers. I said things like they were busy, or that I preferred independence, though the truth burned in my chest. I couldn't explain that my parents had chosen not to help me, that they had looked at the fork in the road between their own comfort and my future and walked away without hesitation. To admit it out loud felt like confirming something shameful about myself, like I wasn't worth the investment. It wasn't just the money that hurt. It was the way my struggles seemed invisible to them. When I visited home during breaks, my parents acted as though everything was fine. My mother commented that I looked tired, as if the exhaustion was a mystery instead of the result of her choices. My father told me I should learn to manage my time better, never acknowledging that I was holding together an entire life on scraps. They spoke about my brother's achievements with pride that filled every room, while my own survival was treated like background noise. There were moments when I nearly gave in to despair. I would sit in my tiny dorm room, staring at bills stacked on my desk, wondering how much longer I could keep pushing without breaking. But alongside the despair, something else was growing. A quiet resolve, harder and sharper than anything I had felt before. If they weren't going to claim me, then I would claim myself. Each small victory became a private rebellion. The first semester I paid in full without late fees. The day I managed to buy my own used car outright. The moment I was promoted at my tutoring job because a parent had praised my work. None of these milestones would ever make headlines in my family's conversations, but to me, they were proof. Proof that I was capable of building a life without them. Proof that their neglect had not defined my limits. Still, the bitterness never fully left. I carried it with me in quiet ways. In the stiffness of my shoulders when my mother bragged about how she had supported us all these years. In the hollow smile I forced when my father said families should always stick together. Their words rang false, and each one cut deeper because I knew how empty they were. By the time I graduated, the exhaustion had etched itself into me, but so had something else: independence. I walked across that stage in a gown I had paid for myself, listening to families cheer loudly for their children. My own parents clapped politely, as though attending was obligation rather than pride. For a moment, that hurt almost as much as the stolen fund had years earlier. But then I reminded myself of the truth. I had gotten here without them. Looking back now, I see those years as both punishment and preparation. The stolen fund had forced me into resilience, had shaped me into someone who knew the weight of every dollar, the value of every earned opportunity. I didn't yet know how that resilience would serve me, but deep down I sensed it would one day be the foundation for something bigger. The betrayal had taken so much, but it had also given me a fire I would never have found otherwise. And as another holiday season approached, I felt that fire stirring again, ready to burn away whatever silence they tried to wrap me in. Every family has stories that get repeated so often they start to feel like folklore. In mine, one of the most enduring stories was my mother's dream of celebrating New Year's Eve by the ocean. She described it every December with the same reverence other people reserved for prayers. She said the year should end with salt on the air, music spilling into the night, and champagne raised as fireworks burst over the water. She said one day she would rent the perfect beach house, gather the family together, and host a night that would finally feel like the life she believed we deserved. I grew up listening to those stories with a mixture of longing and confusion. Longing, because the picture she painted was intoxicating. Waves rolling in rhythm with fireworks, the whole family laughing in the glow of string lights, the sound of glasses clinking against the backdrop of the sea. Confusion, because I knew, deep down, that her vision had no place for me. It was a dream she built around herself, my father, and my brother. I was always a shadow in the corner of those fantasies, rarely acknowledged and never central. She would talk about it most often when we were decorating for the holidays. While my father grumbled about tangled lights and my brother sprawled on the couch pretending to help, she would stand by the window, staring at the horizon as if the city skyline might dissolve into waves if she wished hard enough. She would say that the beach was where new beginnings belonged, that the sea washed away the disappointments of the year before. Sometimes she even added that she wanted to make it a family tradition, something future generations would remember as her legacy. I used to nod along, offering polite noises of agreement, though inside I was torn. I wanted to believe she meant family in the broadest sense, one that included me. But each year proved otherwise. When she spoke about it to relatives, she listed who would come: my brother and his future children, my father and his old friends, even distant cousins she hardly kept in touch with. My name was rarely mentioned. When I once pointed out that I would love to be there too, she brushed it off lightly, saying of course I could come if I wanted, as though my inclusion were an afterthought she had only just remembered. The older I became, the more her dream turned into a symbol for me. It wasn't just about a house on the beach or a night of celebration. It was about being left out of her vision of perfection, excluded even from her fantasies of the future. That beach house became the stage where I knew, instinctively, I would never be allowed to stand in the spotlight. What made it worse was how vividly she imagined it. She clipped pictures from magazines of coastal properties, holding them up as examples of what she called the ideal. She watched television specials about glamorous parties by the sea, pointing out details she wanted to replicate. Sometimes she would sigh dramatically and say one day, when the timing was right, she would make it happen. My father would smile indulgently, my brother would nod distractedly, and I would sit quietly, wondering why it hurt so much to hear her exclude me without even realizing it. By the time I was an adult, her dream had calcified into a kind of obsession. She reminded us each December that she was still saving for it, still planning for the day it would finally happen. She spoke about it as though it was inevitable, as though the beach house was a destiny waiting for her to claim. What she never acknowledged was that she had already stolen the only savings that were ever meant for me, the $12,800 that could have been my own foundation. While she fantasized about waves and champagne, I was clocking shifts, stacking pennies, and fighting for a life she had taken from me before it even began. The contradiction gnawed at me. On the one hand, I wanted to see her happy, to believe that maybe if her dream came true, she would finally look at me differently. On the other hand, every mention of that beach house filled me with a resentment I could barely swallow. I thought about all the nights I had fallen asleep over textbooks after 12-hour shifts, all the meals I had skipped to stretch a paycheck, all the small humiliations of surviving without the support she had promised. To hear her talk about blowing thousands on a single night of celebration felt like salt ground into an open wound. It was in those moments that a quiet idea began to take root inside me. If the beach house was her vision of joy, then perhaps it could also become my stage of defiance. I didn't know when or how, but I felt a spark of possibility each time she painted her perfect picture. The thought whispered at the edges of my mind. What if the dream she cherished most ended up in my hands instead? At first, I tried to dismiss it as wishful thinking, the kind of fantasy you indulge in to dull the pain of exclusion. But the more she spoke about it, the more that spark grew. Each sigh, each clipped photo, each casual mention of fireworks over the sea only fueled my determination. I realized that her obsession had given me a blueprint, and all I needed was the will to follow it. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't undo the theft of my college fund or rewrite the years of neglect. But maybe I could rewrite the ending. Maybe the very dream she had built without me could become the place where I finally claimed myself, where I stopped being an afterthought and instead became the one holding the keys. I wasn't looking for it when I found it. That was the strangest part. I had trained myself to stop expecting things from the world, especially from my family. But one evening, scrolling through listings I could barely afford to glance at, there it was, the house my mother had been describing for decades. Whitewashed walls, wide balconies that faced the ocean, floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the sunrise. It looked like the pages she had clipped from magazines, the backdrop of her fantasies. Only this time it wasn't a picture. It was real, and it was for sale. My first instinct was disbelief. Surely it had to be another coincidence, another house along the endless stretch of coastline. But as I studied the photos, each detail matched her descriptions too precisely. The arched entryway, the terrace lined with lanterns, the open plan that could host dozens of guests. It was her dream in bricks and mortar. I could almost hear her voice in the back of my mind, telling the family this was the house that would finally prove we belonged somewhere beautiful. What she didn't know was that in that moment, I realized it could prove something else entirely. I sat at my desk long into the night, staring at the listing. Part of me thought it was foolish to even consider it. The price was high, the responsibility enormous. But another part, the part still carrying the memory of the stolen $12,800, refused to let go. This wasn't just a house. It was the symbol of everything she had denied me. Owning it would not only be justice, it would be reclamation. The next morning, I called the agent. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. He explained that the property had been on the market for a while, waiting for the right buyer. He asked what drew me to it. I told him I had always imagined a place by the ocean, though what I didn't say was that it wasn't my imagination I was describing. It was hers. We arranged a viewing for that weekend. Driving up the coast, I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and fear, as if I were about to walk into someone else's story. The air grew saltier the closer I came, the horizon opening wide with the promise of sea and sky. When I finally pulled into the drive, the house rose before me like a challenge. The white walls gleamed in the sun, the sound of waves thundered just beyond the dunes. I stepped out of the car and for a moment simply stood there, letting the reality of it sink in. Inside, the house was both grand and intimate. Sunlight poured through vast windows, catching in the polished wood floors. The great room opened onto a terrace where I could picture fireworks reflecting across the water. Each corner of the house seemed to echo with her voice, with all the years she had described what she would one day have. But as I walked through, I felt something shift. For the first time, the vision wasn't hers anymore. It was mine. I saw my own gatherings here, my own laughter filling the rooms, my own future rooted in a place that had once excluded me. The agent asked if I wanted to think about it. He said most people needed time before making such a decision, but I had already made mine. I told him I was ready to move forward. His surprise was polite, but I didn't care. My decision wasn't about practicality. It was about rewriting a story that had never included me. The process moved faster than I expected. Papers signed, funds transferred, keys promised. Each step felt surreal, as though I were watching myself from outside. But when I finally signed the final document, a calm settled over me. The house was mine. My mother's dream, the vision she had spent decades building without me, now belonged entirely to the daughter she had dismissed. That night, I lay awake in my apartment, the contract still fresh in my hands. I thought about how she would react when she found out. Maybe she would be furious, accusing me of stealing what was hers. Maybe she would dismiss it, pretending it didn't matter. But no matter how she spun it, the truth would remain. I had claimed the one thing she thought she had reserved for herself. For years, I had carried the weight of being the forgotten one, the invisible one. Now, for the first time, I held proof that I could turn their neglect into power. The beach house was more than property. It was a statement, a reminder that they could not erase me from every story, not forever. And as the year crept toward its end, I knew exactly how I would use it. Owning the house was only the first step. For a few days, I let myself revel quietly in the fact that I had taken something that had never been meant for me and made it mine. I walked through the empty rooms in the evenings, imagining the sound of footsteps, of voices spilling across the balconies, of music rising with the waves. But it wasn't enough to simply hold the keys. If this was going to mean anything, the house had to come alive. That was when the idea took shape. I wouldn't wait for their gathering to exclude me again. I would create my own. For once, the invitations would come from me. It started with my aunt, the one person in the family who had always shown me kindness even when it was inconvenient. I called her on a Tuesday night, keeping my voice light, But my heart raced as I explained that I was hosting something special for New Year's Eve at the beach. I told her there would be room for everyone, that the house was big enough to hold all the warmth we never seemed to find under my parents' roof. Her response was immediate. She said she hadn't seen the ocean in years, that the thought of fireworks by the water felt like a dream. I could hear the emotion in her voice, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was giving something instead of begging for it. One yes made the next easier. My cousin answered with excitement that spilled over before I even finished explaining. He said it sounded like the perfect escape, that he was tired of the stiff, scripted dinners at my parents' house. Even my uncle, who usually stayed neutral in the quiet politics of our family, softened when I described the terrace and the view. He said it might be time to spend the holiday somewhere new. Each confirmation felt like a weight lifting from my shoulders. For so many years, I had been the one left out, the one whose presence wasn't required. Now people were choosing me, not reluctantly, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to be where I was. It was a shift I could feel deep in my bones, like gravity had realigned, and for once, I wasn't on the outside. I didn't tell anyone about the house's history. No one knew it was the very dream my mother had spent decades describing. I kept that detail close, a secret waiting to bloom when the timing was right. For now, I wanted the focus to be on the gathering itself, on the chance to create something warm and genuine, away from the constant undercurrent of competition and criticism that seemed to linger wherever my parents presided. Planning consumed me. I arranged transportation so that guests wouldn't have to worry about logistics. I began working with a caterer to design a menu that felt festive but indulgent. I pictured long tables dressed in white linen, lanterns glowing against the ocean breeze, music that would swell as midnight approached. Every detail mattered, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I wanted to build the kind of night I had always imagined but never received. There was a strange thrill in the secrecy of it all. My parents had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. As far as they knew, their holiday would unfold as it always had, with the usual guest list and the usual hierarchy. I imagined them sitting down to finalize their plans, unaware that one by one, the names they expected would drift toward me instead. The silence that would meet them when the phone didn't ring, the excuses they would hear about other plans. It would be the echo of my own absence reflected back at them. And yet, even in the midst of this growing excitement, I felt a twinge of unease. I wondered if I was becoming too much like them, using the holidays as a weapon, orchestrating absence to make a point. But then I reminded myself of the difference. My parents had always excluded me to preserve their own comfort. What I was doing wasn't about punishing them. It was about reclaiming joy, about creating a space where I and the people who cared about me could finally belong. If the consequence of that was their empty table, then so be it. As the RSVPs grew, so did my anticipation. By mid-December, the list was nearly complete. Relatives who had never questioned my parents' authority were quietly choosing something different this year. I didn't press them for reasons. I didn't need to. I could see it in their eagerness, in the way they asked about the ocean view, in the relief that colored their voices when they said they were excited to try something new. One night, as I stood on the terrace with the waves rolling beneath me, I let the future play out in my mind. I imagined the sound of laughter rising above the surf, the glow of fireworks scattering across the sky, the moment when midnight struck, and I wasn't alone in the shadows, but surrounded by people who had chosen to be with me. For the first time, the vision felt real. The house was no longer just my mother's dream. It was becoming my reality. And as the year inched toward its end, I felt a strange sense of power in knowing that when the clock struck 12, the celebration would not be hers. It would be mine. The first sign came in fragments, the kind you don't piece together until much later. My brother mentioned in a group chat that my parents were struggling to secure a rental for New Year's Eve. He said they had called around but found that the options were limited, the best houses already gone. My mother, he explained, was frustrated because she had set her heart on one particular property. He didn't name it, but I knew instantly which house he meant. I could picture her reaction as clearly as if I had been standing there. She would have pulled up the listing with excitement, telling my father that this was finally it, the chance to make her dream real. She would have described how the terrace would be perfect for champagne at midnight, how the view of the fireworks would silence any doubt that this was the right place. And then, when she asked the agent about availability, she would have heard the words that shifted everything. The house was already sold. At first, she must have thought it was a mistake. I could almost hear the disbelief in her voice as she pressed for answers, asking who had bought it, asking if there was any chance of a cancellation. But the answer would have remained firm. The house was no longer on the market. It had an owner. What she didn't know, what she couldn't yet imagine, was that the owner was me. The realization hit her later, through whispers and connections she had never expected to betray her. An aunt mentioned casually that she was excited for my gathering by the ocean. A cousin slipped, thanking me for the invitation, before remembering not to bring it up around my parents. Each small clue pulled the truth closer until it could no longer be denied. I wasn't there when the full picture settled in. But I didn't need to be. I knew my mother well enough to reconstruct it. She would have gone quiet at first, her face tightening in a way that signaled her fury long before the words followed. She would have said I was manipulative, that I had stolen her idea, that I had orchestrated this to humiliate her. My father, more restrained, would have insisted I was being petty, that family traditions weren't meant to be disrupted. Together, they would have spun a narrative where I was the villain. But beneath all their words, I knew what truly unsettled them: the silence of their own table. For once, the gravitational pull of the holiday had shifted. The voices they expected, the faces they assumed would appear, all of them were moving toward me. My mother could rage, my father could dismiss, but neither could change the reality. The dream she had built in her head had materialized in my hands instead. When the messages began flooding my phone, I didn't answer. My mother demanded to know why I had done this, accusing me of betrayal. My father said I was being unreasonable, that I was breaking the family apart. My brother sent a short message, saying that I had made my point and should stop. Reading their words, I felt the old sting of dismissal, the way they always twisted the story until I was at fault. But this time the sting was dulled by something stronger, the knowledge that I no longer needed to defend myself. The silence on my end became its own statement. I didn't need to argue or justify. The house, the invitations, the laughter already beginning to gather under its roof, all of it spoke louder than any reply I could give. For years, I had been the one left behind, waiting for a call that never came. Now, they were the ones waiting, staring at their phones, wondering why no one was answering. The absence they had dealt me for so long had finally returned, mirrored back at them with a clarity they couldn't ignore. I thought about them often in those days, leading up to New Year's Eve. I imagined my mother pacing the kitchen, furious at the way the story had slipped from her control. I imagined my father insisting it was only temporary, that things would return to normal next year. I imagined my brother rolling his eyes, telling them I was just trying to get attention. And through it all, I felt a strange calm. The truth was, I hadn't set out to destroy their holiday. I had simply built my own. But their emptiness was unavoidable, because it was the reflection of what they had given me for years. If they felt the cold weight of silence now, it was only because I had learned it from them. And as the year drew to its close, I knew one thing with certainty. No matter what they said, no matter how they tried to spin the story, they could never unsee this moment. They could never erase the fact that the beach house, their perfect vision, now stood as mine. A monument to the daughter they had underestimated. The beach house felt different on New Year's Eve, as if the walls themselves had been waiting for this night. By the time the sun dipped low, the rooms were filled with voices, the scent of food spilling from the kitchen, and the faint hum of music drifting through the air. Guests arrived in waves, their coats dusted with sand from the walk across the dunes, their faces lit with the kind of anticipation that grows only on the last night of the year. I had spent days preparing, and it showed. Lanterns lined the terrace, their golden light swaying in the breeze. Tables stretched across the patio, draped in linen and dressed with flowers that caught the glow of candles. the sound of the ocean was constant, a steady rhythm beneath the rising laughter. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't standing on the edges of a celebration, watching others find their place. This was mine, and the center was finally where I stood. My aunt told me the view was better than anything she could have imagined, her voice thick with emotion as she took in the horizon. My cousin said it felt like stepping into one of those glossy magazine spreads my mother used to admire, only warmer, because this was real and lived in. Even my uncle, usually so reserved, admitted that he hadn't felt this relaxed at a family gathering in decades. Their words washed over me like a tide, not because I needed validation, but because I realized that what I had created here mattered to them as much as it did to me. The night unfolded in layers. Children ran barefoot through the sand, chasing each other with sparklers. Adults lingered over plates of seafood and glasses of champagne, conversations breaking into easy laughter that carried on the breeze. The kitchen was alive with the clatter of dishes, the terrace alive with music, the air alive with something I had never associated with my family before: belonging. And beneath it all, there was the knowledge of absence. I didn't need to see my parents' house to know what it looked like. I imagined their dining table set for too many empty chairs, the harpist they had hired playing into a hollow room. I pictured my mother pacing, angry at the silence of unanswered phones, my father insisting this was temporary. In another year, I might have been sitting at that table, quiet and invisible. But tonight, the silence was theirs. The contrast fueled me, but it didn't consume me. I didn't host this night just to take something from them. I hosted it to give something to myself and to the family members who had long been caught in the middle of a dynamic none of them dared to challenge. Seeing them here, relaxed and laughing, I knew I had given them an alternative. They no longer had to choose discomfort in order to belong. They could belong here, with me. As midnight drew closer, the energy shifted. People gathered on the terrace, the air buzzing with anticipation. The ocean stretched out like a black canvas, waiting for the first burst of light. I passed out glasses of champagne, watching the glow of candles flicker in the wind, feeling the collective inhale of a moment about to crest. When the fireworks began, they exploded in colors so bright they turned the waves silver and gold. Gasps rose from the crowd, laughter mingling with the booms. Someone said it felt like the whole sky was celebrating with us, and I believed it. For once, the universe felt aligned with me, not against me. I stood slightly apart, leaning against the railing, letting the sea spray catch in my hair. As the fireworks painted the sky, I thought about the girl I had been, the one left off invitations, the one who sat quietly while her mother described dreams that didn't include her. That girl had been silenced, diminished, erased, but she had also learned how to endure. And now, endurance had turned into defiance, and defiance into creation. At midnight, the cheers rose high, glasses clinked, and I felt a warmth in my chest that no exclusion could touch. My mother had always imagined this night, this house, this celebration. But it wasn't hers anymore. It never had been. It was mine. As the final bursts of fireworks faded into smoke, I realized something even more powerful than the victory I had won. This night was proof that I didn't need their approval, their inclusion, or their permission. I could create joy without them. I could build belonging from the ground up. The beach house had been her dream, but it had become my reality, and in that reality, surrounded by the sound of laughter and the sea, I finally understood what family could feel like. The morning after New Year's Eve felt strangely quiet, as though the house itself was catching its breath. The fireworks had ended hours earlier, and the laughter had slowly faded into sleep. But even in the silence, there was a hum in the air, a lingering warmth, like the echo of a song you can still hear even after the music stops. I walked barefoot across the cool tiles of the great room, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. The terrace still smelled faintly of smoke from the sparklers. Empty glasses sat abandoned on tables, chairs pushed back in the rush to get outside before midnight. The evidence of celebration was everywhere, and instead of chaos, it looked like proof. Proof that joy had lived here. Proof that I had built something real, not just for myself, but for the family who had chosen to be with me. One by one, people began to emerge. My aunt appeared in a robe, her hair pulled back, smiling in that soft way people do when they've slept well after a night of happiness. She said it had been the best New Year's she could remember, that she hadn't felt this included in years. My cousin wandered in not long after, still yawning, but he added that the evening had reminded him of how family was supposed to feel: effortless, warm, without judgment. Their words touched me more deeply than I let on. I had always imagined this night as a personal reclamation, but hearing them speak, I realized it had been a gift for them too. Throughout the day, the departures began. Suitcases were carried down, cars loaded, and hugs exchanged with the kind of lingering sincerity that promises more than just politeness. My uncle said I had done something brave, even if it caused trouble later. My aunt said she hoped I would make it a tradition. Each goodbye left the house quieter, but the quiet was different this time. It wasn't absence. It was fulfillment. By late afternoon, the house was mine again. I stood on the balcony, looking out at the ocean as the waves rolled in steady rhythm. The air smelled of salt and wood smoke, and the horizon stretched endlessly. For the first time, I didn't feel the ache of exclusion pressing at the edges of my chest. I felt settled. I felt strong. But peace never lasts long when it comes to my parents. That evening, the first messages began to flood in. My mother's words were sharp, a storm disguised as sentences. She accused me of betrayal, of deliberately orchestrating a spectacle to humiliate her. She said I had stolen her dream, twisted it, and flaunted it in front of the entire family. She described my actions as calculated cruelty, as though I had plotted for years to strike this particular blow. My father's messages followed a different tone, colder, but no less cutting. He said I had broken the family apart, that I was selfish and ungrateful. He said traditions mattered, and I had discarded them for my own pride. To him, the beach house gathering wasn't a celebration. It was an act of war. Even my brother chimed in. His words were shorter, but filled with the same frustration. He said I had made my point, that I had embarrassed our parents enough, and now I needed to stop. He implied that the family would never look at me the same way again, that I had crossed a line no one else would have dared to. I stared at the screen for a long time, the glow of their accusations pulling me back into old patterns. For years, I would have responded immediately, defending myself, explaining, pleading to be understood. But this time, I let the silence stretch. I didn't need to justify what I had done, not when the proof was all around me. I thought about how my mother had spoken for years about her dream beach house celebration, painting a picture where I was never included. I thought about how she had stolen my college fund without hesitation, leaving me to piece my future together alone. And I thought about how many holidays I had spent at their table, invisible, waiting for crumbs of attention. Compared to those years, their accusations felt almost hollow. Still, their anger wasn't easy to dismiss. A part of me, the part that had spent decades trying to win their approval, recoiled at the thought of being cast as the villain. I felt a heaviness in my chest, the old ache of wanting to belong where I was not wanted. But then I reminded myself of what had just happened. I reminded myself of the laughter in the house, of the fireworks reflecting in my family's eyes, of the way my aunt's voice had cracked with gratitude. Those moments were real. My parents' anger was only noise. In the days that followed, the fallout spread. Cousins messaged me quietly, saying my parents had called them demanding to know why they had chosen me over them. One relative admitted that my mother had described the entire night as sabotage. Another said my father insisted I had manipulated everyone, though they admitted privately that no one had been forced. Each person had chosen freely. It was strange, hearing their twisted versions of the story. They couldn't accept that people had come to me willingly, that the warmth of the gathering had been enough to draw them away from their cold traditions. Instead, they needed to believe I had schemed and manipulated because the alternative was too threatening, that their hold over the family had finally slipped. I could have corrected them. I could have called and argued and tried once again to explain myself. But I didn't. I had already spent too many years trying to rewrite their narrative, only to watch them dismiss it. This time I chose something different. I chose silence. It wasn't an easy silence. Some nights, lying in the dark, I replayed their accusations in my mind, feeling the sting of being cast as cruel when all I had ever wanted was to belong. I wondered if I had gone too far, if I had become like them in my attempt to free myself. But each time those doubts rose, I remembered the night itself. I remembered the fullness of the house, the ease of the conversations, the warmth that had wrapped around me like a shield. That memory was stronger than their words. The truth is, their anger revealed something I had never seen so clearly before. For years, I thought I was powerless, always at their mercy, always waiting for scraps of approval. But now I understood that power wasn't something they had taken from me. It was something I had given them by needing their validation. When I stopped needing it, when I created my own celebration without them, their power dissolved. That was why they were furious. Not because I had embarrassed them, but because I had proven I didn't need them. The beach house was more than a property. It was proof. Proof that I could take what had been stolen from me and build something stronger in its place. Proof that their silence and exclusion had not defined me. Proof that family could mean something different. Not obligation, not hierarchy, but choice. As the waves rolled in that night, I stood on the balcony and let the ocean air fill my lungs. My parents could rage, they could twist the story, they could paint me as the villain. But the truth was unshakable. For the first time in my life, I had taken the pen from their hands and written my own chapter. And no matter how much they tried to erase it, they would never be able to change what had happened here. The first week of January carried a stillness I had rarely known. The echoes of New Year's Eve still lingered, in the corners of the terrace where lanterns had swayed in the wind, in the faint scent of wood smoke that clung to the walls, in the memory of laughter that seemed to ripple through the house even after the guests had gone. The beach house stood quiet now, stripped of celebration but heavy with meaning. For me, it had become more than a property. It had become proof that I didn't need permission to belong. I spent those first mornings wandering through the rooms as if seeing them for the first time. My hands trailed along the polished wood banisters, my feet echoing softly against the tiles. I opened the balcony doors to let the ocean breeze rush in, reminding myself that this wasn't a dream. I had hosted a night that my family would remember forever, a night they could never take from me, no matter how loudly they tried to rewrite it. My parents had wasted no time in making their opinions known. My mother accused me of betrayal, insisting I had turned her dream into a weapon. She said I had manipulated relatives, that I had forced them into my orbit out of pity. My father told me I had broken the family apart, that my gathering was selfish pride disguised as generosity. My brother added that I had embarrassed them all, and that the damage would last for years. Their words came to me in messages and phone calls I chose not to answer. Reading them, I felt that old ache stir in my chest. The instinct to explain, to defend, to prove myself once more. But this time, the ache didn't pull me under. I had already lived the truth. I had stood on the terrace at midnight, watching fireworks reflect in the eyes of people who had chosen me freely. Their warmth had wrapped around me like a shield. That memory was stronger than any accusation. For years I had believed that if I could just earn their approval, I would finally feel whole. But standing in that house after the celebration, I realized something different. Their approval had never been the prize. The prize was freedom. Freedom from needing them to see me. Freedom from contorting myself into the shape they wanted. Freedom from begging for scraps at a table where my seat was always optional. At first, I thought the beach house was revenge. I thought buying it, hosting the gathering, and letting them taste absence would balance the scales. And maybe a part of it had been that. But when the noise quieted, I understood what it truly was. It was reclamation. It was belonging. It was proof that I could take what was stolen from me, the $12,800 fund, the years of exclusion, the silences that left me hollow, and build something stronger than what they ever offered. I thought of the girl I used to be, sitting in her dorm room surrounded by bills she couldn't pay, exhausted from double shifts, crying quietly because her parents had chosen themselves over her future. I thought of the young woman at countless holiday tables, quiet at the edge while everyone else laughed, praying to be noticed and never being called by name. And then I thought of the woman I had become, standing on a terrace with fireworks bursting above her, laughter wrapping around her and choice in her hands. That girl had been silenced, but she had also learned endurance, and endurance had led me here. The days after the gathering were filled with whispers from relatives. Some said my mother had been furious, demanding explanations no one gave. Others admitted my father had tried to insist the family had been manipulated, but no one believed him. A cousin told me that my parents were embarrassed most of all by the silence of their own table. The empty chairs, the awkward music, the realization that their authority no longer commanded loyalty. Hearing it, I didn't feel triumph so much as clarity. They weren't angry because I had humiliated them. They were angry because I had proven I didn't need them. That was the real shift. Power had never been something they took from me. It had been something I gave them, every time I begged for recognition. The moment I stopped asking, the balance changed. The moment I built my own celebration, their hold broke. I didn't respond to their endless accusations. I didn't demand apologies or explanations. I simply sent one line, once, that I had a wonderful New Year's Eve, and I hoped they had too. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't a weapon. It was a truth, and it was enough. Silence became my choice after that. A silence not born of exclusion, but of peace. For the first time, their narrative no longer mattered to me. They could paint me as difficult, as selfish, as the villain who fractured the holiday. But I knew my truth. And so did the people who had stood beside me as the clock struck midnight. I began to imagine the future differently. Maybe some relatives would drift back to my parents' house next year. Maybe others would return to me. Maybe the family would remain split forever. But the uncertainty didn't terrify me anymore. Because now I knew I could build joy with my own hands. I could make my own table, my own traditions, my own warmth. One evening, I stood alone on the balcony, the waves rolling steady below, the stars scattering across the sky. I thought about all the endings my parents had written for me, the endings where I remained small, overlooked, and invisible. And then I thought about how I had rewritten them, turning silence into connection, turning absence into belonging. The beach house was more than a property. It was a monument to the truth I had finally embraced, that I didn't need to be chosen. I could choose myself. And if you're listening now, maybe you know that feeling too. Of waiting for an invitation that never comes, of shrinking yourself for a place that isn't meant to hold you. If this story resonates with you, I hope you'll subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because the more we share these stories, the more we remind each other that being excluded doesn't make us invisible. It means we have the power to build something better,